Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It's now my pleasure to welcome you to the 7th annual Joan MacKenzie Davies Lecture. Since 2020, this knowledge-sharing component of our annual general meeting has recognized the outstanding service of Joan MacKenzie Davies, the former CEO of OASW from 1992 until 2019. It is my distinct honor today to introduce today's keynote presenter for the Joan MacKenzie Davies Lecture, Dr. Carolyn Mack. Dr. Carolyn Mack, she, her, is an assistant professor teaching stream at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. She has been a practicing social worker in the Toronto community for almost 25 years. Much of her career has included working with children, youth, and their caregivers in schools. Carolyn's career began in family service and children's mental health organizations, and then she worked for a number of years at the Toronto District School Board as a social worker. After time in the public school board, she had the opportunity to join Kids Help Phone, Jeunesse J'écoute, a national nonprofit charity offering anonymous counseling to young people. There, she was the director of knowledge mobilization and program development, guiding the team that offered the online and phone counselors. Between 2015 and 2024, Carolyn returned to school social work practice and worked at Branksome Hall, an independent girls' school in central Toronto, where she spent several years serving the junior school and then transitioned to the Director of Wellbeing and School Counseling. In 2023, Carolyn was honored as the recipient of the Ontario Association of Social Workers School Social Work Achievement Award. Currently, she teaches Masters of Social Work students, including the Foundational Theory and Practice courses and Cognitive Behavioral Therapy and School Social Work courses. Carolyn is passionate about finding new and innovative ways to teach and engage the next generation of social workers. She was the 2024 recipient of the International Coalition of Girls' Schools, ICGS, H. William Christ Educator Prize, for her work collaborating with international cohorts of elementary and secondary educators on action research projects. Carolyn's research interests include teaching and learning about social justice and clinical social work, and how social workers can combat anti-Black racism and the practice of civil discourse skills. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining us today and for your work as a social worker.
Thank you so very much, Dorian, for that very warm welcome. And I'm so pleased to be here with everybody this afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity and honor to be able to speak to you all in this Joan MacKenzie Davies lecture. My talk today is called From Turmoil to Transformation, How Everyday Social Work Competencies Benefit Clients and Communities in Challenging Times. I chose this title in part because some dear colleagues and I had the opportunity to write a paper in the last year about anti-oppressive social work education called From Turmoil to Transformation, Advancing Anti-Oppressive Social Work Education in an Era of Instability. Shortly, I'll tell you a bit about why I thought talking about our everyday competencies as social workers is relevant. But first, even though I know we started our meeting this afternoon with a land acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge the land also myself. This is in part because I'm hoping that today's dialogue with you will be in part a reflection of the way I teach. And of course, in our teaching at University of Toronto, we often start with land acknowledgements. And so in my own journey to understanding truth and reconciliation, I've learned that our personalization or contextualization of why a land acknowledgement is important is a key aspect to ensuring that it is as authentic as possible. So I'm accompanying my land acknowledgement today with some images that I've taken, the first one that you can see on the screen. This is a painting at the McMichael Gallery in Kleinburg, Ontario, which is in the northwest part of the Greater Toronto Area where I live. It's a painting by Norval Morisseau called Thunderbird with Inner Spirit, and it was painted in 1978. In French, the title is Oiseau tonnerre habité par un esprit. I was at the McMichael Gallery in December with a friend, and I just found this painting to be so incredibly striking and compelling. I know in the last number of years, many of us have been collectively developing a greater consciousness and awareness about our relationships with Indigenous peoples and issues. For non-Indigenous peoples like myself, who are settlers, for reconciliation to occur, we need to make substantial changes to the way we educate about Indigenous peoples and issues and the way we treat Indigenous peoples, as well to make sure that we are really truly envisioning a future that's truly inclusive. I just found that as I've been going along my own journey towards learning about truth and reconciliation, that this painting just brought about such incredible mixed feelings of joy, as well as feelings of sadness. It evoked so much emotion in me in terms of its color and its form. And while I'm certainly not an art critic or anybody with an artistic eye or possibilities or capacities, I can't draw, I became very attracted to this piece because I think that it embodies much of what I'm starting to learn about Indigenous cultures, which is that there's a great deal of complexity, joy, and beauty within these multiplicities of cultures. Part of what I've also learned is that there's a powerful relationship to land and water, and that land and water are not just resources to be used, but ones to be respected. They're not to be exploited or controlled. Norval Morrisseau the artist, was born in 1932 and died in 2007. The McMichael Gallery put an inscription that says this: Norval Morrisseau was a founding member of the Professional Native Indian Artists Incorporated and is widely regarded as the originator of the Woodland School style of art. Born on the Bingwi Nyashi Anishinaabe First Nation, formerly Sandpoint First Nation, on the shore of Lake Nipigon in northwestern Ontario, Morrisseau was raised by his maternal grandparents, who ensured that he learned the oral histories, traditions, and ceremonies of his Anishinaabe heritage. He maintained these teachings despite being forced to attend the St. Joseph Residential School in Fort William, Ontario, now part of Thunder Bay, and they would become an important aspect of both his life and art. Morrisseau's art first gained prominence during the mid-1960s, and he was awarded a Canadian Centennial Medal by the Governor-General. He was inducted into the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts in 1973, emerging onto the contemporary art scene during a time when public opinion of Indigenous art was only just starting to shift from an anthropological to a fine art context. Morrisseau revolutionized Indigenous painting practices through his bold compositions and vivid color. These paintings depict aspects of shamanic ceremonial life, as well as commentary on his own lived experiences of colonialism and those of Indigenous people in Canada. I share this inscription because I think it's important to understand where this art comes from and the background that was infused from the artist's life that comes out through the artwork itself. Often, when we think about schools, we think about social work's complicity with the atrocious abuse in residential schools and historical oppression of Indigenous peoples. It can become a pretty sad story pretty quickly. But I'm also hoping that in recognizing that this painting, as it is, inspires you the way it has me to think about the complexity and joy within Indigenous communities. In thinking about the land, I also wanted to acknowledge some of the beauty around us in our natural surroundings. If we go to the next slide, please. In the last few weeks, I was able to see the cherry blossoms here at the University of Toronto, where I work. This is just outside University College, a sole cherry blossom tree just coming into bloom. It was a cloudy day, as you can see, but it's just something that I think shows some of the solitary beauty in the cherry blossom's ability to be resilient, despite the fact to this point, spring very much feels like it has not sprung up yet here in Toronto. I'm not sure what it's like in the rest of the province. And we can go to the next slide, please. I was also able to go and have the privilege of visiting friends who live out in Alberta recently, and we traveled to Banff. This is a picture that I took of some of the mountain ranges at the top of Sulphur Mountain. We went up this gondola to the top and we're able to walk between platforms where you're surrounded by the majesty of the mountains around you. It was not a particularly sunny day also, but sometimes when you position yourself in the vastness of nature, you realize how privileged we are to live in this country and to have settled on this land that was stolen. Next slide, please. I also wanted to share that I'm learning a great deal from a text I'm reading right now called Teaching Where You Are by Shannon Leddy and Lori Miller. Teaching Where You Are is about weaving Indigenous ways of knowing and slow principles into teaching. And I'm very grateful to colleagues here at the faculty who I'm reading this with in a book club. I highly recommend the text. Part of what I'm learning and unlearning through reading this book is that time is not just a commodity or something we always need to abide by in strict ways. Things will take the time in the way they are meant to take. And so while I aim to finish within a certain amount of time today, and I've timed myself and I've practiced, I also realize that this keynote and address will take as long as it needs to. I'm finding that I'm appreciating being able to slow things down in a hectic life. I don't know how many of you in the Toronto audience are in the Toronto area like I am, but I've lived here most of my life, and I find that the pace here is just increasing, and maybe it's my middle age, but I feel like slowing down and being able to think about things from a perspective where not everything needs to be about efficiency and speed is something that I welcome and that I'm trying to adopt. Now, having said that, all of that, I want to acknowledge this land on which I sit today, which is at the University of Toronto. It has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn on this land. So thank you for allowing me to contextualize some of where I am in terms of my own thinking around Indigenous truth and reconciliation. I would be remiss not to acknowledge, as we have earlier in the meeting, the transatlantic slave trade as well as other global conflicts, both of which have displaced millions of people over time. We're global citizens of this world, and acknowledging some of these dark histories as well as present-day atrocities is part of what we need to do to look towards rather than look away. In the Western world, we're often afforded the privilege of looking away rather than looking towards, whether it's local issues in our cities or broader issues in our nation or even globally. Sometimes, or rather something that I'm trying to do in my everyday practice as a social worker and as a human being, is to allow myself to experience the discomfort of acknowledging injustice and disparity, hatred and discrimination. And many of our fellow global citizens don't have that opportunity to look away because they experience everyday harm or persecution. I start each course with this contextualization and land acknowledgement because as I was preparing my remarks for today, I was contemplating how I can engage with you, even though this is a webinar. And I very much hope that you'll put your questions as we go in the Q&A, and that we'll have time to have some dialogue together at the end of my remarks through the question and answer portion. The best way I know how to engage, besides demonstrating part of how I teach at the university, is by trying to be as authentic as possible and to draw from what I know and my own experiences. So in some ways, I'll take from what I know as a teacher of social work students by introducing parts of myself. Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen this photo of me in the advertisement for this talk. And while this is a fuller photo of me from that advertisement with my beloved dog, Encore. I wanted to bring her into this because, as I do in my teaching, I want you to understand a bit about who I am, because I think that's important to develop credibility and trust, even though we're in a webinar together. You might be wondering why you should listen to or engage with me today, and I think if you're asking that question, it's a really fair one. I've also questioned myself coming up to this talk about what makes me qualified to have the opportunity to address all of you, because in many ways, I still see myself as a novice in many areas, even though I've been a social worker for almost 25 years. This photo of me and Encore captures a moment of joy, the joy that I had being Encore's mom. She passed away in October 2025, and while it's still hard 7 months to talk about, I wanted to show you this picture to symbolize that while I identify as a social worker, and it's important to me, there are lots of other identities that I possess as well. What you see on the screen my identity as a dog mom was one of my most important identities. But I also identify as a partner to my husband, a daughter of immigrant parents, a sister, a friend, a Torontonian, a city person, and a lover of tennis, cello playing, and anything to do with sloths. I can tell you about that at another time. I'm so lucky to be employed at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. And I've been very fortunate in my career to have been and continue to be mentored. I've worked also in incredible places where I hope that we've made a difference to young people. And I hope by sharing some parts of myself that you'll see one of the most important values to me in my teaching and in aiming to be authentic, which is that I hope to be transparent while at the same time being boundaried. I hope that this humanizes me a bit to you and that perhaps my modeling some of this vulnerability will embolden some of you to reflect on your own professional impact and practice. I came to social work because I absolutely adore stories. I remember as a child always wanted to hear more about people's personal affairs, and maybe that just makes me nosy, I'm not sure, but I've always wanted to understand how to be helpful to people. I grew up thinking that I'd be a helping professional, like both my parents, and for a long time I thought that the only way to that avenue was through a medicalized route by becoming a doctor. Well, I quickly found out in my undergraduate years that I was not meant to be a medical doctor, when I could not identify cells on slides, when I could not remember anything in anatomy or physiology, and when I could not successfully breed fruit flies properly in my genetics class. I realized there were other ways to be helpful to people besides a medical route. And I think this is where I felt I was very privileged to have been introduced to a social worker myself when I started working on my own in my own therapy. And this is what opened the door to me thinking about social work as a career. And while I know that many people who are attending this afternoon are psychotherapists and social workers, I want us all to think about how broad in scope social work careers can span. This is an incredible career field where we have the opportunity to touch and be involved in lives all the time, whether through direct practice or other community-based or macro ways. As promised, I wanted to come back to the title of today's talk, From Turmoil to Transformation, because frankly, I've been feeling a bit more than a bit disheartened by the state of the world. And I feel like we need to maintain hope as social workers. Maintaining hope and developing resilience are related skill sets that are so essential in the work that we do. And I call it a skill set because I think it actually takes ongoing practice and intentionality. I also feel like the everyday competencies that we possess as social workers gives me a feeling of pride in the profession and in its aims, which are in part to advocate, to help lift oppression from those who are marginalized, and to be supportive, empathic helpers. The impetus for this talk also came from discussing a project that I'm involved with currently at the faculty, where we're using simulation, meaning we're using actors to portray roles, to help MSW students advance their social work interviewing skills, social work competencies, and civil discourse skills. It's made me reflect on my belief that what social workers do daily makes a difference, not just to clients and communities, but that we are transformed as helpers ourselves. The project's premise is that everyday competencies that social workers have intersect with civil discourse skills all the time. The idea that we need to listen deeply, to empathize, to notice, and take action when we see injustice are within our scope of values and ethical actions, which I also see as being part of civil discourse. So the purpose of today's lecture is really to reaffirm that what we are doing in these complex times is needed and effective. In a time where there is polarization and dehumanization, our attempts to see nuance and different perspectives, as well as our ability to rehumanize, are more important than ever. Just like in the classroom, you may hear ideas today that you disagree with, or you may find that my ideas resonate with you, but maybe you wish that I'd expressed them differently or even more strongly. I had asked you to try and hold different perspectives in mind at the same time, because social workers often are engaged in dialectics, where two things that seem like opposites can be true. Perhaps hearing what I have to say will reaffirm a position for you or an idea that you have. And in any case, I invite you to stay open-hearted to the ideas that I discussed today. If you feel provoked, I see that as a good thing, because sometimes we need to be affectively moved to think deeply and make change. Next slide, please. I'll start my formal remarks by saying that in my blurb that I used to advertise this talk through OASW, I wrote that social workers are everyday heroes. Well, let me talk a little bit about that because I think this is a somewhat controversial idea. I put an asterisk next to social workers are everyday heroes because I realize that it's hard to consider yourself to be a hero when you know there's been a complicated and historical past that lingers into present day, where we as a profession cannot be proud of all of our actions. Our profession's involvement in the 60s scoop, as an example, or sometimes being caught up in entrenched systems of oppression that do little to move the needle for marginalized groups. When we think about our profession's involvement, it doesn't seem to completely reconcile with us being heroes. For example, when I was a school social worker, I often asked myself whether I was doing enough, whether I was fighting against policies that excluded certain students, and how my actions or inactions were perceived by other constituents in the system. Knowing these histories and present-day problems makes it difficult for us to necessarily wear the mantle of being heroes easily. However, having said that, I do choose to say that we are heroes because I think that the aims and values of our profession really push us to try to be those heroes, not saviors, but to be those people who advocate and move aside to make room for others to have or share power. Our person and environment perspective allows us to see ourselves as part of the systems we are trying to change. We may be heroes, but if we are, we're flawed heroes because we're human. Part of me accepts this and the complexity that comes with it with some grace and humility. And other times, it's harder to stay hopeful and to reconcile what I aspire to be in the profession while I also perceive our reality. Next slide, please. You're going to notice as I go forward that I'm going to be working in threes today, in threes. I want to talk about three complexities of our times. And then in the second part after that, I want to talk for the bulk of the time about how we as social workers in our everyday roles address contemporary issues in a successful and effective manner. And thirdly, the third part of the three is that I'm going to try and ground us in our values and competencies and demonstrate how those are useful to us in these hard times. Next slide, please. So let's start with some of the hard stuff. Let's start with the turmoil. There are many contemporary issues of importance, and these are just ones that I've named here, three of them again, that are not necessarily evidence-based or research-based, but they're things that come to mind for me as an everyday social worker and person. These contemporary challenges I'm naming have wide impacts on us all as individuals and professionals. The first challenge is rapid change and uncertainty in the context of global conflict. Things feel like they need to be efficient, fast, and that nothing can get in the way of progress at any cost. There is so much violence, harm, disparity, and human displacement in our time and history right now. I simultaneously want to lean in to knowing more and developing a deeper understanding of all of these issues, and at the same time wanting to look away, something I mentioned before. The disparities between the haves and the have-nots is getting wider, and what is in mainstream news is often, to me, very demoralizing and very difficult to digest. It sometimes feels like what I know to be stable and right is ultimately being turned on its head. It's disturbing, to say the least, to see social media weaponized and used as a site of disinformation and vitriol and personal attack. I'm not sure for those communities directly or indirectly impacted by war, displacement, and violence, how silence from individuals, communities, and organizations must be perceived when the silence feels deafening. And it's hard to know what to say. When the war in Iran broke out, all I said to my students was that I had to recognize and acknowledge the difficulties and disparities in our own diverse class, where certain students had direct impacts and ties to the war, and others didn't. It continues to be hard to find the words to express the horror, disbelief, and tragedy around us, and what often to me feels like a race to the bottom, where the bottom keeps falling out. The second challenge that I want to bring up is the advent of artificial intelligence and its uses, both good and frankly, for bad. In academia, we have a lot of discussions about academic integrity and its impacts on social work education. But beyond that, artificial intelligence brings up issues around privacy. And for us as social workers, for those of us in direct practice, the use of chatbots for counseling and its impacts on social work practice is enormous. Of course, there are many good uses to AI as well, including that it can help us ideate, help us save time sometimes, for example, with tasks such as documentation. It can generate some really good ideas for everyday tasks such as meal planning, making lists, and helps us with our executive functioning. And yet, I think that like many things that are good tools, we must be judicious about the way we use them. We must remember that AI is not a substitute for human relationship, human feeling, human cognition, and human connection. The third issue that I think brings a lot of angst for me and perhaps for others as well is this idea of social injustice. There's so much going on right now in terms of climate change, racial and gender injustice, and a 24-hour news cycle where injustices are constantly in our inboxes and in our feeds and in our faces. It seems incredulous to me that exclusion, discriminatory policies, and cutting off support to marginalized groups seems to be becoming normalized, particularly in the US context. I worry very much that the rejection of science, the denial of the warming of the planet, and the casual ways in which we normalize visual and other types of violence will forever disrupt and change our daily lives. So those are my three contemporary issues of importance that are somewhat depressing and certainly tumultuous. So I want to move on to thinking about how we address these issues as social workers. Next slide, please. One way to think about what we can do in our profession is to consider the competencies that we develop over time and that we use daily, no matter what our role as social workers is. This diagram is a model of holistic competence from the book Using Simulation in Assessment and Teaching, OASW Adapted for Social Work. It was written by Marian Bogo, Mary Rawlings, Ellen Katz, and Carmine Logie. The OASW stands for Objective Structured Clinical Examination and is a tool that we currently use in our faculty to observe development competencies in social work students. I had the good fortune of that Marian Bogo is one of my teachers in my MSW, and sadly, she's unfortunately since passed away, but there's a lasting impact of her research and work and the work in training the next generation of social workers. At the center of this diagram is the notion that social work practice is complex. It's a combination of skills, judgment, knowledge, and the ability for us as workers to self-regulate. I reflect upon my days in practice in schools and in the community. Sometimes I really feared that a student or a young person might harm themselves or be harmed. It was in those situations that I had to use my judgment to decide what skills I would employ to be supportive, helpful, or to intervene. I needed to acknowledge both theoretical and practically I needed knowledge rather, not acknowledge. I needed knowledge, both theoretical and practical, to make good decisions as good as possible. And lastly, I had to manage my own emotions of fear and worry for the young person. What I especially appreciate of this model is that none of these competencies occur in a vacuum. They're guided by our professional values and the organizational and community contexts in which we work. Using these competencies that we develop over our whole career ongoingly, we can appreciate the complexity and nuances in our work. In the first day of one of the courses that I taught this past year in school social work, I explained to my students that they must start to become comfortable working in the gray zone. Those zones, those gray zones, where things are not clear, not certain, and not defined. I know that for many of us, that's the space in which we occupy and work and need to become really comfortable. Next slide, please. Here we come back to threes. These are three useful approaches for social work that I think many of us are familiar with, especially in the last number of years when we've had more emphasis and awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion. These three perspectives or lenses are ones that I try to consider to put into practice as much as possible all the time, whether it's in the classroom, in practice with clients, or whether it's because I'm thinking about broader macro implications. These three approaches are being trauma-informed, using decolonial methods, and being anti-oppressive. But we hear these words all the time these days. What does that actually mean to be these three things or to adopt these lenses? For me, the idea of being trauma-informed is not making assumptions about people's experiences of trauma. I think this is critically important in a time when there's so much coming at all of us all the time. We sometimes distinguish between small and big T trauma, with big T trauma being those acute incidents that occur that can lead to trauma or trauma responses. When I think of small t trauma, I think of the expression, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. The cumulative effects of everyday microaggressions or aggression, exposure to adverse events, and experiences can lead to deep impacts on our psyches. I think it's very important to ensure that we are not assuming anything about our students, our clients, or the people who are affected by the work that we're doing in communities. In the book that I mentioned earlier that I'm previously that I'm reading, Teaching Where You Are, the authors cite Maori professors Leonie Pihama and Linda Smith, who note that for Indigenous peoples, quote, trauma can be viewed as a contemporary manifestation of the succession of systemic assaults perpetuated through colonization and oppression. That is a deep quote. I feel that that quote sums up how trauma, colonization, and oppression are all entangled. Trauma and oppression do not always show up as interpersonal either. As the quote says, there are ways that systems wear individuals and communities down. We also need to think about our colonial past, especially here in Canada. I had written a paper, an article a few years ago about decolonizing school social work. And one of the things that as you learn through life, I suppose, is that you have the benefit of hindsight. What you would have said instead, knowing what you know today versus what you knew back then. At the time when I wrote the paper about decolonizing school social work, I wrote about decolonizing from the perspective that it meant upending and dismantling dominant discourses. And while I still believe that to be true, my perspective on this has also shifted in that I believe that it's impossible to divorce the idea of decolonization from a colonial past where Indigenous peoples have been displaced from their land, water, and the resources that were stolen from them. I think this is something we need to keep in the forefront of our minds today because we don't want to repeat the past mistakes we've made in communities and societies. We also need to think about how a colonial past has influenced the ways in which our minds and ideas are colonized in present day. So taking a decolonial approach means that we're respecting history and really trying to navigate new waters where we're not repeating the wrongs of the past. Lastly, anti-oppressive practice really means to me this idea that we're thinking about all types of oppression and trying to work against it. Oppression, whether it's transphobia, misogyny, sexism, ableism, racism, ageism, all the different isms that you can imagine, all of that oppression really is about trying to think about the umbrella term. What I want to say, though, is that it's not simply about how to push back against oppressors, but really thinking about how we dismantle systems that perpetuate that kind of ongoing oppression that can occur towards individuals and communities. I think about how grounding in our values as social workers allows us to be more transformative in our practice and to make a deeper impact. When I was a contract lecturer at what is now Toronto Metropolitan University, my colleague who I was teaching with had invited a guest speaker whose name is David Lewis Pert. David came to speak to our class on social work theories to an audience of second and third year BSW students in the program. I don't remember everything that David said that day because it was over 10 years ago, but I do remember that he said, "You can't make a deep imprint if you step lightly." He warned social work students against being swept up by structural oppression and going along with the status quo, and challenged the audience at the time to think about what they were going to do with their power as burgeoning social workers. Today, I think these three pillars of being trauma-informed, practicing from a decolonial lens, and being anti-oppressive are ways that we can step in more deeply, like he suggested, to make the imprints we desire, and that individuals, groups, and communities actually need us to do this. Now, don't get me wrong. I think sometimes there's a time to be stepping more lightly or stepping around when we need to self-preserve, when we need to avoid burnout, when we need to make space for others. However, overall, I do think that David is right, that to step deeply in our job is part of being a social worker. And it fits with our Canadian Association of Social Workers' first social work value of respecting the dignity and worth of all people. So here comes another group of three things that we can do to practice that demonstrate our commitment to ethical practice that's rooted in our professional values. Number one, respecting people's autonomy and agency. Number two, using non-judgment as a skill. And number three, being advocates for social justice. These kinds of espousals of social work guiding principles and values can be easy, but putting them into practice can be harder. I'll give you a personal example. A couple of years ago, I was living in an area of Toronto where we had lived for about a decade. I used to say that my neighborhood, which was rapidly gentrifying, was colorful, which was a code word for saying that there was a growing socioeconomic disparity where people with more economic power and flexibility were metaphorically pushing out the original inhabitants of the neighborhood who were less well off. My family, we lived around the corner from a community health center where, as part of their services, there was a safe injection site. I know that the politics and beliefs of social workers are to respect the autonomy and agency of those struggling with addiction, to use those necessary services at safe consumption sites, and not to judge those choices. I know as a social worker that we must advocate for those who are marginalized to have the opportunity and the rights to meet their full health potential by offering and using such services. But in this case, I could tell that my head and my heart were starting to separate. The me that was a social worker was very much in favor of the safe injection site, but the me that was a citizen that didn't want to come back home to some paraphernalia that I found in the backyard was less sure. I share this example because I believe that as social workers, as much as we hold strongly to our professional values and guiding principles, our ethics, at times we're going to feel personally challenged. It's in those times that I think our training to accept being and living in the gray zone, that our abilities to self-regulate, to use our judgment skills are the most important. Social work is one of those careers where it's hard to separate the personal from the professional. I find that for me in challenging times, going back to my foundational training and reminding myself of my values, again, both those that are personal and professional, help ground me in my making of decisions. And in this way, what's good for our clients and constituents is also good for us as the workers and human beings. Next slide, please. So what does this all look like in practice? I think the most important roles for us as social workers in these days and times that are so complex is that we first need to be empathic supports. I attended Smith College, and one of one of the primary designations or orientations of that school was to be psychodynamic. We learned quite a lot about psychic defenses and splitting. And while you may not ascribe to that school of thought, not everybody does, and that's okay. I think what we can likely see or agree to is that when we are in challenging times, human beings don't always show their best sides. To use the clinical language, we split, and we see ourselves as all good and others as all bad. The ability to see and experience nuance becomes harder to access. But empathy is partly how we connect with other human beings and how we show our care for others. If we have the capacity, being able to model and enact empathy, I think, is one of our most foundational skills in interventions. Number 2, I also think we need to be relationship builders, now more than ever. In a time where there's so much polarization, hatred, discrimination, I think this idea that we are relationship builders is incredibly important. Many of our clients don't have people in their lives because of the isolation and loneliness that many people, especially in adulthood, experience. Having meaningful relationships is so important to human thriving. For those of you in direct practice with clients, think about times where a client thanked you for being there or where you've planted a seed for future connection. For those of you working for communities with constituents you may not know or meet, think about how your ability to think relationally impacts your ability to do your job. And even if it's not with clients, many of us work with colleagues. Relationships matter, and while they're imperfect, they're often the source of strength and resilience. Thirdly, I think the social workers need to be risk takers. This goes back to what David Lewis Pertz said about being able to make a lasting imprint if you're able to step in deeply. Last year, I decided that my mantra for the year was going to be to take healthy risks. And one thing that I did that pushed myself out of my comfort zone was that I actually joined a musical improvisation class. The class ran several weeks, and we had to culminate in singing in groups and solos at a comedy club at the end for our friends and family. And even though my musical improv career is not going to take off and I'm not going to quit my day job, I think this is a nice illustration of how taking risks in our personal lives can influence our professional lives as well. It reminded me that I'm not always going to know or be able to be prepared for things as well as I would like. That's the beauty of improv. There are parallels because social workers take risks in creative thinking, and they need to engage with risk in creative thinking too. Questions like, how do I get my clients resources that they need? How do I advocate for increased opportunity? How do we teach to intrigue and develop critical thinking? It can be risky to be a risk taker, and not all of us have the same privileges. For some with certain intersecting identities, it can be easier to step into some challenging situations, while for others, it can be more difficult because structural oppression and stigma get in the way. Lastly, as I'm starting to bring my talk to a close, I want us to be thinking about what the future holds, given the current present day. Every day, there is calamity and tragedy, but also joy and resilience. So what does the future hold? I think this needs to come together this way. At first, I thought about maybe giving you some tips and key messages, which is typically how keynotes end, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think I just wanted to be clear what my main message is. What you're doing every day makes a difference. I don't know who of you needs to hear this today, but whether you're a psychotherapist, you're working with clients in the community, or indirect practice through your policy and programmatic work, whether you're working in your first language, or maybe you're taking a break from social work, maybe you're contemplating a next career move, or maybe you even feel burned out. Remembering that social workers are needed across sectors, that every role is important, that what you are doing every day with your social work training makes a difference. It doesn't make just a difference to your clients and those you serve, but to your inner self as well. I recently finished a term at the university teaching in the winter, and I had a student approach me after class one evening. She confided in me that while she was a few weeks away from graduation, she wasn't entirely sure if she felt that she wanted to pursue social work as a career. She confided in me that she was afraid that being a social worker would hurt, that there would be a personal toll. I really appreciated this student's candor because the fact is, sometimes social work does hurt. It can hurt to see others hurting. It can hurt to feel complicit in massive systems that really feel very difficult to budge. It can hurt to advocate for social justice while also recognizing grotesque inequity. But we, here today, are answering the call to action. We chose social work, and maybe for some of you, you feel that social work chose you. What you are doing every day makes a difference. Next slide, please. So rather than me telling you some tips and takeaways, besides the fact that you're making a difference, I thought we should maybe perhaps leave on a note of reflection. So rather than me being didactic, I wonder if you might just take a moment to reflect on these ideas of what is your why? For me, and I promise this is my last final 3 of the afternoon, I think about number 1, who are my people? Who are the people to sustain and encourage and bring you professional or personal joy? Think about who those people are, envision them in your mind. I've been so lucky to have been mentored and cared for by so many social workers and friends who are also not social workers. Who are the people who cheer you on, who knock on your metaphorical or literal door to see how you're doing? Who do you like to support, and who brings out the best in you? Try and jot down that person or those people's names before you get too far along, and maybe consider letting them know that they're your people. And for those of you who feel isolated and it's hard to think about who your people are, I'd encourage you to be gentle with yourself and to think about the wonderful association we're part of that you're in right now. You deserve support and connection. Number 2, I want you to think about how in your work you're using any one of the 3 lenses that I mentioned about being trauma-informed, decolonial, or anti-oppressive. For some of you, maybe this isn't something you have a chance to think about during your busy days, but let's just take a moment to reflect. What small actions have big ripples for your practice and day-to-day work? How can examining your own history, biases, assumptions, and practices make you a better and more effective social worker? For those of you who already feel like champions of this work, how can you share your wisdom and methods with others? Lastly, and thirdly, what is your why? Why are you a social worker? Why are you a social worker and not a psychologist, a nurse, a doctor, a child and youth worker, or another helping professional? Why are you a social worker, and how have you aligned the values of social work with your personal values? Who are you doing this for? I want to end with a poem that's become meaningful to me. In 2017, I went to see my friend Katie graduate with her PhD. She was the graduation speaker, and she ended her remarks with this poem that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. Since then, I've ended all my classes with this closing. And I share this poem because it's not only short and beautiful, but I think it necessarily speaks to what it is that we need to do as social workers. Even though I first heard it in 2017, it's still as true now as it was then. The poem is called Don't Go Back to Sleep. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door sill where the 2 worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. This is by Rumi, translated by Coleman Barks. I want to genuinely thank all of you for your attention, for being here in this Zoom room with me, and for really considering what it is that we do and why. I also want to thank people in my personal network who have helped me develop this talk. And I name them by name, not to name drop, but because I think it's important that we recognize those people who have uplifted us to get where we need to go and to help us sustain our practices. So I want to thank Dr. Kelly Mandarino, Dr. Allison Mitchell, Dr. Mariana Bergeron Doherty, and I also want to shout out 3 mentors who within minutes of seeing that I was giving this talk by email, reach out to me. Dr. Faye Mishna, Dr. Deborah Levine, and Dr. Barbara Muscat. They knew I was giving this talk and they reached out to encourage me. Thank you to Kaylin Boyd and Barney Savage at the association and all the staff who've made today a successful event. Thank you, and I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your practice wisdom and personal vulnerability with us this afternoon, and reminding us that even amongst there are deep struggles in this season that folks are facing, that there's still privilege and joy and hope and strength in being a social worker, especially when we speak and act collectively. So we're going to have some time for questions this morning, and I see that folks are already asking some, and people can put them into the chat. But I would like to correct a bit embarrassingly that I may have actually mispronounced Joan MacKenzie Davies' name incorrectly. And so I'll name that's extra awkward because I think we're grateful to also have Joan joining us this morning or this afternoon. So Joan, please accept my apologies and thank you for your many years of service. And Carolyn, thank you for honoring that service and commitment to the profession with your keynote and your work. And just, yeah, being willing to share and be vulnerable, in an online space with so many folks this morning, recognizing that we're all bound together in this profession. So Carolyn, there are a number of questions that have come in, and I don't know that we'll get to all of them, and there are some folks behind the scenes that are helping, sort through them. But our first question, and it's a good one, is how do we hold boundaries as social workers without really becoming disconnected from the folks that we work with or over-professionalized about what it means to be a social worker?
I think that, as I mentioned briefly in the talk, I think that boundaries are incredibly important, and yet we need to find that fine balance point between being boundaried with ourselves and our clients and the people we serve in communities, as well as just making sure that we need to find that fine balance point between the boundaries and being human. And I think that this is something where, again, I lean back on social work competencies to really think about using our judgment skills and our self regulation to be able to, you know, lean on our networks to find out where is that balance point for me. For some people, it might be further in one part of the spectrum, and for others, it's going to be in another part. I know for me, I was in a talk yesterday where I was listening to somebody talk about teaching and learning, not in the social work context, but where they were talking about teaching, and they gave out their cell phone numbers to their students. I wouldn't personally do that, but that's also just sort of where my comfort zone is. So I think part of it is that we need to be critically conscious enough of our own comfort zones and where we need to lean in and where we need to be human with people while also self-preserving, so that we have boundaries. The thing about boundaries is that for me, once you sort of release a boundary or become a little bit less boundary, you can't rein that back in. And so I think that our own awareness of where those lines are for us, and they're going to vary for different clients and different people and different constituents, I think that that is part of the decision making that goes into my thinking about that. And I appreciate the question.
Yeah, it's a common one, right? And what I love about social work is that we're a profession where we don't take there's no one clear answer to some of those things, right? Context very much matters, and situation matters, and we get to wrestle with those things. Um, we have a question from a newer social worker who asks, and this is a really good question. How do we stay compassionate, in polarized times when there are folks who we know sometimes, hold views or are doing things that are fundamentally opposed to what we believe is right, and we know that there are real impacts to that, and yet we still have to maintain a certain level of compassion and decorum, and try and meet people where they're at. And that's a hard thing to do, I think, in this season. So do you have any thoughts around how we hold that tension, or how in particular newer social workers can find a way to do that in a season that's so rough for them?
I really appreciate this question also. Thank you for the person who posed it. And I love that it's coming from someone who's maybe earlier on in their career, because I can speak about a moment where early on in my career, within the first 6 months of me graduating with my MSW, I traveled to Chicago to listen to John Gottman, who many of you may be familiar with. John Gottman is a psychologist who does a lot of evidence-based work in couples practice, and I attended a several days workshop in Chicago. I had the opportunity as somebody who was fresh out of school to ask John Gottman a question, and it was something similar to what I was just asked here, which is really a full circle moment. But
I
I
love
got
that.
up in front of a ballroom and asked, how do we, what if you think one of the partners in the couple is wrong and you just despise what they have to say? And John Gottman said, you need to love all your clients. And now I know he didn't mean that, literally necessarily, but what I've taken with me from that time in my career is this idea that we need to really humanize and see the best in our clients as much as we can. And that can be hard. That can be hard when we disagree fundamentally with some of their belief systems, or when their belief systems seem to contravene our values, either professionally or personally. But I think we need to be able to see the humanity in our clients and understand. And I think that's where, not to be such an academic, but I think that's where social work theory is so incredibly important, to be able to help us understand, why are people operating the way they do? Why do people present themselves the way they do? And to stay absolutely curious all the time, and to exercise cultural humility about what we think we know about people. I think that's how we try and stay compassionate, is by trying to see the best in people. And you know what? I'm just going to say it's really hard right now. It's really hard to do that when there's so much bullying and discriminatory remarks and squashing of marginalized groups. It's really hard to really tap into humanity. And yet I think that's part of what I think we do so well as social workers in our fundamental training, is seeing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual.
Thanks, Carolyn. That's a beautiful answer. And love before you'd also named, you mentioned about having a network, right? And we all want to view ourselves as compassionate, but we all have days and times. I certainly have where you're not your best self, or you're human and you're frustrated with something. So having those, those networks of people to support you in that, especially as a new social worker, and to uphold you and remind you that we're not alone in these challenges. That there's even here at OASW, there's 10,000 of us who probably can bring similar experiences and support folks in similar ways. That folks again aren't alone, and don't let that frustration and hurt kind of be internalized fully. And I do hope that every social worker has some folks with deep practice wisdom like yourself that they can lean on as they start out in their career. And the next questions, it's sort of similar but a little bit different. And I always I have this question still after having been a social worker for a long time. I don't always get it right, but what does it mean to lead with both deep conviction but also humility and curiosity?
Oh, such a good question. I think I'm going to answer this from a slightly different perspective, which is that I guess part of the opposite of that question is, how do we not become completely, what's the word that I want to use? Complacent. How do we still lead with passion and conviction without becoming complacent, and also still be effective and not burn ourselves out? It's a great question. I think one of the things that really helps me, and this is not evidence-based, or it's just based on my own experience, is that I think that when you're able to surround yourself with people who are willing to cheer you on, doesn't mean they have to agree with you, but that who are willing to give you energy that is positive, that helps you sustain your practice and your convictions even when it gets tough. I think that's part of it, is not becoming complacent, remembering, and this is why I ask people to reflect on, what is your why? Why did you become a social worker? How do you do this in a way that is effective, but is sustainable as well? Because there's definitely been times, and I'll be totally vulnerable about this, and I've said this to some of my classes as well, is that there have been times where I've been burned out. In these 25 years almost of being a social worker, it was almost like the conviction and the workload was too much for me. But the way I climbed out of that was by sometimes changing my environment, sometimes, leaning on my networks, and being able to really ground myself in what is it that is within my locus of control, And if it's not within my locus of control, how do I lift other people up to keep going with the work? It's not um, it's not a career where you can be a lone ranger. It's really where what we espouse about individuals working and being people in communities, that is part of being in a social work career field and profession as well. Um, so I think that some of those things have helped sustain me, and I hope that answers the question a bit.
Thank you. Yeah. We have time just for, I think, a couple of more questions. I appreciate there's lots of great questions here. Um, how do you distinguish between healthy critical reflection of tough issues and difficult ethical situations and compassion fatigue, where you get in a space where maybe you're consumed by that kind of work? If that question makes sense, the way that I
Yeah,
framed it. Okay.
it absolutely makes sense. I think, again, this is partly where we need other, sometimes social workers, sometimes just people who are trusted others in our lives to hold a mirror to us, to be able to say, how am I doing? And how is the work impacting me? Because, like I said in my remarks, we are all impacted by our work with individuals and communities. Um, so I think that having others around us who are able to hold up the mirror and really engaging sometimes in our own reflective practice. We talked about critical consciousness or reflexivity in understanding ourselves as practitioners, as social workers. I think being able to take regular time to say, where am I in the grand scheme of what my goals are personally and professionally? Where am I in the grand scheme of myself in my organization, whether it's that I'm a sole proprietor as a psychotherapist, or whether it's that I'm in a community or a hospital or a large organization, an association. Being able to sort of locate yourself is one way to be able to say, okay, like, am I slipping into compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma even, which is very possible for those of us who work in the profession. So I think that it's really, I'm going to keep coming back to the same thing, the idea of communities being super important to us in being able to sustain practices that last for a long time.
Communities like the Ontario Association of Social Workers, or yeah, other spaces where we can all collectively gather, and that has been a common theme, right? That you've come back to, and I think one that's just universally true, where none of us can do the task of what it is to be a social worker on our own. And there'll be times where we have more strength and conviction and ability, I think, to do that than others. But that collective sense of we all are moving this forward, maybe imperfectly, maybe we need to learn from one another, but there's deep hope in that, and I really appreciate how you frame that today. The last question, it's a bit of a personal one, but I'm excited to hear the answer, is you mentioned discerning, that we should discern our why we want to become a social worker. And I love to ask people that question. More than one person has said, because I was bad at math, which I think is kind of funny, but I know there's a little more to it than that in most cases. But how is your why, you want to be a social worker / stay a social worker? How has it changed over time, or has it?
This is a wonderful question, and I'm so honored to have the opportunity to answer it. I think definitely my why has shifted over time because my understanding of what it means to be a social worker has shifted over time. Like I said in my remarks, I kind of came to this because I couldn't become a doctor. And I met a social worker who was incredibly helpful to me in my university years. It was a personal way that I came to social work. But thankfully, I think my very basic understanding of, well, I wanted to be and hear people's stories, I wanted to be helpful to people, has expanded to being able to understand that social workers are so valuable because we take that structural systemic perspective everywhere we go. That social justice is a cornerstone of our profession. And that's something that I've, become more enamored with, that I embrace more, that I um, really appreciate very much. In fact, we're conducting a study right now about what social justice means to MSW alumni. Um, what is what is what sets us apart from other professions, as I said. And so, yeah, the why has changed. It's also changed because I've had the privilege of meeting with so many young people. And this is where I might just get a little emotional because I think about all the clients that I've met, and I haven't certainly helped all of them equally. I certainly wasn't able to move things forward for everybody. But the privilege of having the opportunity to work with and for young people and their families has allowed me to see the humanity and like the gross inequity also, but also just the incredible joy and resilience of communities and peoples. And that has sustained me through times where I've felt burned out. And that has uplifted me when I have, felt like giving up, frankly. Being able to know that there are people who need the support, appreciate the effort, that you can build significant relationships with. And sometimes those relationships oftentimes are temporary because we're only in a season of our clients' lives. But that really makes a difference. And I think that is also what has fed the why of why I do what I do. And now I'm so privileged to be able to teach the next generation of social workers. And that has been a wonderful adventure. I just started here in January 2025 in this capacity, but I'm just so honored and privileged that students trust us as educators with their opinions, with their perspectives, and it's just been a wonderful journey of learning. So I've been incredibly fortunate to have wonderful mentors, like I said, and yeah, the why has changed, but the foundation of it has remained fairly steady, and just sort of the nuance around understanding the broadness of social work has changed over time for me.
Thank you, Carolyn. And yeah, thank you so much for the keynote and yeah, just leaving us with a bit of inspiration, right? And again, we all come in here, it's a heavy season. You can flip on the news or go into social media for like 2 minutes and be pretty overwhelmed, I think. But to have, a space to intentionally chat about these things and for you to lead us in that takes a lot of courage and strength. But I'm very grateful that you were able to do that with us this morning. And I leave with lots of things, bouncing around in my head around what it means to be a social worker, but also just very grateful to be part of this really unique profession, and full of just fascinating folks, and you're one of them that we get to hear and learn from and grow together with. So thank you very much, Carolyn.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dorian.
Hey, good afternoon again. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for you sharing such insights on how we can protect and harness our energy to advance the changes that are required. You have definitely left us feeling energized and motivated about what's possible for the future. And really thank you for how you've also answered the questions. And I thank you to everyone who joined us today for your commitment and support of the association. We look forward to continuing our work together to chart the course for the next chapter for our profession. So thank you so much for being here and for having a great morning and afternoon with us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and bye-bye.